And also, we're still joined here by our IDF Reserve Colonel and lawyer, Penina Sharvit Baruch. You led the IDF's legal department here, international law department, for many years, some 20 years. Now, I also want to mention to our viewers, again, these are live images of the Gaza city skyline, the Gaza border region as well with Israel, so we'll keep our eyes on that situation. As we continue to discuss here, we're talking about the concept of what appears to be success from this. Now, Penina, in terms of the battlefield being one arena, but obviously the social media environment, the international media environment, the discussions taking place among foreign governments, what at the end of the day is seen as most important?
I think Israel wants to have, first of all, freedom of action as much as possible, and secondly, eventually, that the outcome will not put the pressure on Israel, but the pressure will be on the Hamas to make the concessions. So here the issue of legitimacy is crucial. And here exactly we have the challenge of explaining that what you see, the destruction, what is seen around the world, the destruction of Gaza, of so many people being uprooted from their homes, civilian casualties, that this is not a result of an excessive use of force by Israel, but actually of the strategy of the Hamas, the way the Hamas operates. Because once again, if you accept that there was no option but to use force to stop the barrage of rockets continuing all the time, then the question is how much force?
Is Israel's force disproportionate? Just to ask you that question bluntly here, this is what you've spent decades working in here. There's a lot of claims that Israel's using disproportionate force. This is the claim leveled at us right now as the casualty figures are lopsided as they are. But is there disproportionate force? What do you say about what Israel's doing?
So I say that Israel is using, I think, proportionate force. It's using precautions to minimize harm to civilians. Yes, the results look like devastation, but when you take into account that the Hamas, that there's no military, there are no military bases of the Hamas that Israel could bomb and spare civilian objects. All the Hamas military infrastructure is embedded in civilian infrastructure. They use civilian houses and schools and mosques and hospitals as launching pads, to store ammunition, as headquarters. They have the network of the tunnels to fight underground under all these civilian buildings. So the only way to stop Hamas, to weaken Hamas militarily, to stop them from firing rockets, is to hit infrastructure that seems civilian, but actually under the legal terminology. And as you said, I was in charge of the operational legal advisors in the IDF, and we have legal advisors there from the level of the division commander upwards, headquarters, government, advising on the laws of armed conflict. And the laws of armed conflict acknowledge that a civilian object, civilian infrastructure that is used for military purposes loses its immunity from attack. Is not considered civilian anymore, but rather a legitimate military target. And then the issue of proportionality. Yes, you have to balance between the advantage, the military advantage that you expect to get from the attack with the collateral damage to civilians and civilian objects. There's no formula here. It's just what you have to do the balancing. But again, when you take into account that everything is being done from civilian objects, so in this balance, you do reach a lot of harm to mainly to civilian objects, but it's still proportionate because the military advantage you seek is to stop them firing rockets non-stop at Israel. And we also have to take into account that Israel used a lot of precautions. There's an obligation also to take precautions to minimize harm to civilians. That's also entrenched inside Israeli orders, inside the legal advice that the commanders are being get. And that's why Israel is issuing so many warnings, not only because of the legal obligation, because it really wants to spare civilians. And civilians have been given the chance to evacuate from most buildings prior to attack. And while there is considerate number of casualties on the Palestinian side, and every casualty, especially every child, is of course a tragedy. But most of the casualties are not civilians. Most of the casualties are Hamas operatives. And yes, since they act from within civilians, using civilians as shields, unfortunately, civilians also get hurt, get killed. This is a tragic reality of that is the outcome of the way Hamas operates.
And certainly, as you mentioned, no playbook to go by. Military leaders around the world looking at the really unprecedented nature of the conflict being waged here by Israel on this complicated situation, as you highlight, in the Gaza Strip. But Harel, all these things being highlighted here, and what appears to Israelis to be really a slam dunk case that this is a justified operation. We're talking about a democratic country with, as Penina highlights, an entire legal advisory board within the army advising on every strike, the surgical operations, doing everything they can not to harm civilians in a civilian enclave dominated by terrorists who are firing at Israel's civilians. Despite all this evidence and the reality as we see it of the situation, why does Israel appear to be losing that argument in the international arena, especially on social media, who appears to be a blind eye to many of those facts? How's that playing out in the social media realm and the discussion at large?
Right. First, I would say that we're outnumbered in comparison to all those anti-Israeli elements that are working. We are outnumbered. Now, I'm saying that the IDF is conducting an amazing kind of an operation, really, particularly if you compare it to other previous operations. However, in that arena that you've just mentioned, I think we have a lot to do, a lot to learn, and particularly to plan strategically of how you tackle, how you handle this international arena, and there's a lot to be done there. I must say that still, having said that, we should take into account that it's a world, I mean, social media arena is a world of bulbs, I would call them, clusters or echo chambers, which Israel can say whatever it wants to give its own narrative, but at the end of the day, if this echo chamber, let's say, of Palestinians in America is close to us, or progressive is close to us, that's it. It's very hard to penetrate it, and you really need to have someone who is a planner, who know how to infiltrate it, and to begin with right, established understanding of how it works, how social media works, and therefore to apply the right methodology for it.
In some ways, is that arena more important than even the military arena right now in this conflict?
Well, it's certainly one of the arenas that we need to win, I would say. We are fighting in a multilateral front. We just talked about the military one between us and Hamas, but in fact we're fighting in a multilateral front, and of course all of them are important. Take into account that most of the youngsters today, the youth, are having their news from social media all around the world, and therefore, of course, you need to win this arena as well, and to tackle it right, to address it in a strategic manner.
And back to you, Penina, here before we still have some minutes before the break here. Looking at what may be more influential at this point. There are some arguing in the international arena that Israel shouldn't be responding, even with these airstrikes as we do to these attacks, that there would be a better way for Israel to wage this war and actually level pressure on the militants of Hamas and Gaza here. Is there any weight to that argument that this isn't the way, that militarily, as we've seen, isn't actually the way to tackle Hamas?
I would love to have an alternative way. I think using force is the last resort, not only legally, but I think morally. I think from the point of view of Israeli interests, we don't want to have violent clashes and don't want to have casualties, civilian casualties in Gaza, but what is the alternative? I mean, when I'm asked this question, I turn it back to whoever asked and say, give me an idea. I mean, I would love to hear. That's the reality. We are facing an enemy that is not accepting our existence, is using violence, and is interested actually in pulling us towards these violent clashes. So it's a win-win situation for Hamas. Either it is terrorizing our civilians, or it is showcasing the victims on its side. Anyway, it wins, but unfortunately, And for Israel, this is not a good reality, but I don't see any alternative. So the alternative is really to put a lot of pressure on the Hamas, and but to also teach. I mean, it is important that it won't get away with it. If violence makes Israel cave in, this will only bring more violence. And if we allow Hamas to become the representatives of Palestinians out large in Jerusalem, inside Israel, this will be a fatal blow to anyone who wants a peaceful resolution of the conflict. So we have to understand that sometimes force is needed in order to enable us to reach peace. And
thank you, Penina and Harel. Just a minute left here. A response.
I'd like to add an example to emphasize my point. Hamas, we know that the poverty rate in the Gaza Strip is 80%. 80% and a 20% of fat elite that is exploiting the resources and investing billions in this subground infrastructure, in expensive missiles, training elite forces. Where does all this money coming from? And I think this is a point that Israel needs now to emphasize and to tell the world. It's not the fact that Gaza is besieged. By the way, it's not besieged. It's not under a siege. And it's the fact that they are investing everything they have on the expense of their people.
Thank you for being with us so far, Dr. Harel Chorev and Penina Sharvit Baruch. Appreciate your input so far on our live special. We are stepping out for another break here, 4 minutes. We'll be back with much more live coverage of the ongoing conflict.